Well, we're at that time of year. The church year is coming to a close. Including today, there are only 3 more Sundays left before the beginning of Advent. It doesn't feel like it because it's like 70 degrees outside this morning, but Advent is only 3 weeks away. Advent is the beginning of a new year in the church, so we're kind of at the end of the teaching year in the church, and this is the time of year when our gospel lessons always sound a little bit apocalyptic. Our gospel lesson today takes us to Matthew's 25th chapter, and as it turns out, the end of Jesus's teaching lines up with the end of our church year. I mentioned we're in Matthew 25 today. The very first verse of the next chapter, if we were to read on, the first verse of chapter 26, marks the conclusion of Jesus' public ministry. That's the time when he's no longer speaking or teaching or preaching in the public eye. So as we follow Jesus in the chronology or in the timeline of his life, where we find our reading today is toward the end of his time preaching or teaching in the public eye. And in Matthew's gospel, by the time we get to the 25th chapter, Jesus is moving a little closer to the cross, a little closer to the crucifixion, and he's preparing his disciples for that time. He's also thinning the crowds around him, because by this point in Jesus' ministry and in the weeks to come leading up to the cross, he surrounds himself only with his close friends and his disciples. So it's in these final days of Jesus teaching the crowds that he shares this parable that we read today, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. It's a story about preparation, about being ready. It's a story that was told to the disciples during their time of preparation to get them ready for what was to come. And that's kind of the theme of this story of the 10 bridesmaids, being ready, getting ready. Now, to be honest, readiness is, truthfully, it's not something that I know a whole lot about. As I was working on this message this week, it occurred to me that I've never lived more than maybe 10 minutes from the closest grocery store. I've never lived more than about 10 minutes from a Walmart or a Dollar General. I've never lived more than about 10 minutes from a gas station. So readiness for me is very different than what readiness means to someone who lives out in the country. And when I say out in the country, I don't mean like Sebastopol. I mean somebody like way out in the country. You know, there are people in this country who have to drive more than an hour to get to town. I don't know that we understand what it means to be ready until we've lived in that kind of a context. I've got family in Batchtown in Calhoun County. Does anyone go to Calhoun County for the peaches? Yeah, they're wonderful. My family in Batchtown, I remember them making the hour-long drive to Jerseyville or Alton every few weeks to stock up on basics, on household essentials. Folks who live out in the country, they know a thing or two about being ready, more than those of us who live in or near town. They know about stocking up on things like kerosene for space heaters, in case the electricity goes out, or stocking up on cases of bottled water in case the well pump goes out, that sort of thing. Maybe even a portable generator. Or maybe even those of us in town have had to learn about being ready. Maybe, I don't know, something like a pandemic sweeps across the land and we all feel like we have to stock up on toilet paper, right? How many of you stocked up on toilet paper this spring? You know what? No, you don't have to identify yourselves. But I know that some of you have closets full of toilet paper at home still. I trust that if I ever run low, somebody would offer the pastor a roll or two. Readiness is part of a natural thing in us. When we feel like there's a shortage, when we feel like we're going to be isolated, we have this natural tendency to stock up. That's human nature. But how do we live in a state of spiritual readiness? How do we stock up on faith? What does that even look like? And that's what Jesus is preparing his disciples for in this parable today, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. Some of the bridesmaids in our parable seem to think that the groom is going to be coming very quickly. So they make no readiness whatsoever. They just run right out to greet him and wait until he comes. Some of the bridesmaids realize they might be waiting for a while, so they stock up. They are ready for a long return. The conventional understanding or interpretation of this parable of Jesus is rather simple. Jesus tells his followers that he will return. though we don't know when, we don't know how long. Jesus himself doesn't know the day or the hour. When his return does happen, we have to be ready, somehow, some way, ready. The disciples are struggling to understand what this means. Jesus is saying, keep doing the work, keep being the church, mind the store until the owner gets back. That's the lesson that we get from this parable. You see, the early church, those first disciples, they lived with this sense of urgency. They believed that the second coming of Christ would be imminent, so imminent that first generation of believers would see it happen in their lifetime. Any day, most folk who heard Jesus speak believed that he would be back before they themselves died. And centuries later, here we are. We're still waiting, still waiting, still waiting, still waiting, still waiting. That might surprise you to know that people aren't generally very good at waiting. Did you know that? Does anyone here struggle with patience? I won't make you raise your hands. You know who you are. Maybe you're also the ones with toilet paper stocked up in your closets at home, too. Some of us are not very good at waiting. I know the people who work in customer service know this very well. Last Wednesday, I went through the McDonald's drive-thru in Highland and got a pumpkin spice latte because, you know, pumpkin spice latte, that's God's gift to humanity every fall, right? You go to the speaker box, place the order. The first window, you pay for the order. I went to the second window to get the coffee, and the lady handed it to me after I waited about 30 seconds. And when she handed it to me, she looked terrified, like I was going to scream at her, and she said, "I'm so sorry for your wait." I had only waited 30 seconds, and that made me realize we're that type of society, you know, that we can't wait for 30 seconds without people feeling like they're inconveniencing us. And then I'm wondering, I hope I didn't do anything to make her feel like I was mad about waiting for 30 seconds. And then I wonder, do McDonald's people really get yelled at for making customers wait 30 seconds for coffee? Maybe they do. We're not good at waiting. Christ will return, but until he does, what do? Do we just sit and wait? That's what this parable talks about, you see. Jesus says, no, we're not supposed to just sit and wait. That's the point. The 5 foolish bridesmaids, that's exactly what they do. They run out and they sit and they wait. The problem is the waiting lasts longer than they're prepared to sit. They run out to meet the groom and they just waited. And the 5 wise bridesmaids, they took extra oil with them. And the oil in this parable, if we go back into the Old Testament and the old Jewish teachings, oil is symbolic of living a life of faithfulness. Oil is symbolic of living a life of righteousness and following the teachings of God, following the law, or in this case, following the teachings of Christ. So maybe the best way then to understand this parable is to put it into sort of a modern context, because honestly, ancient Israelite wedding banquet customs, that sounds more like a Jeopardy category than something we can relate to in our day-to-day lives. So let's try it this way. Did you ever take piano lessons as a kid? Anybody? Yeah, we've got a few of you. Good. Ruth's going to talk to you about playing next Sunday in church. Busted. I took piano lessons for a while. I gave piano lessons for a while when I was in college. The thing about the piano, or any instrument really, is it doesn't matter how good the instruction is that you receive. If you don't practice it regularly on your own, you're not going to get any better with it. And that's true of piano, it's true of any instrument, it's true of most things in life, right? If you don't practice what you've learned, you're not going to grow in that skill set. So let's try this parable a different way. Let's try the parable of 10 piano students, if you'll bear with me here. 10 piano students had all been given a wonderful lesson by their piano teacher, and then each student had been assigned a piece to play and had been given basic instruction and guidance regarding the music. 5 of these piano students were foolish. They sat at the piano bench and simply waited for the piano teacher to return. The other 5 piano students were wise, and they began practicing their music over and over again, running through the music, becoming more familiar with each note on the page. The piano teacher was very delayed in her return to the students, but when she did return, each student sat at their piano, prepared to play what had been assigned. You see where this is going? Yeah? The 5 foolish students who had not been practicing their music at all, they went to the 5 wise students and said, help us learn this music. Help us to know what this music is. And the 5 wise students said, it doesn't work that way. You have to go back to your piano and practice. You just have to put it into practice on your own. And so while those 5 foolish piano students were frantically trying to learn their music, the 5 wise students were invited into the community recital. And as the recital began, the lights dimmed and the door was shut. And while they were frantically trying to learn their music, after they finally learned it, those 5 unwise or foolish piano students came to the recital and knocked on the door and said, we know our music now, let us in. But the piano teacher said, no, I'm sorry, it's too late. The recital has already begun. Now maybe that makes a little more sense than a wedding banquet parable. To translate this into our faith, we have a parable here about spiritual readiness. Spiritual readiness is not the same thing as waiting until Jesus returns. Being spiritually ready does not mean simply waiting. It means that when it comes to our Christian living, we actually have to put into practice what we've learned. It means just like playing a musical instrument or just like an athlete learning to sharpen their skills in the game they play, or just like anything else we do that requires skills in life, the more you use it, the more you grow in it, the better you become. If you don't use it, you lose it. You're either growing or getting worse, getting better, or declining in your skill. That's the way it works. So when it comes to this parable today, the oil in our gospel lesson represents practicing our skills, growing in our faith, putting into action what we've learned. Taking extra lamp oil means not just sitting and waiting for Jesus to return, but by keeping ourselves focused on living our lives the way that Jesus teaches us to live them. Not to merely believe and then wait, but to actually put our faith into practice. Having faith, but not putting it into practice, that's kind of like having a car but never driving, or having a piano and never playing, or having books and never reading, or having a nice pair of walking shoes but never going outside. Having it but never using it means you might as well not even have it at all, right? Over and over and over again, Jesus shows us what God is like. God does not take time off. We know this. God never takes a break from loving us generously. God never takes time off from being prepared. God never stops forgiving us. God never ceases to watch over us. God never rests from that desire that we should follow him, not just in our beliefs, but in our actions and in our lives. And the thing about Christian living, or spiritual readiness, is that God asks us to put our faith into action in just the same way. The same way that God never takes a moment off. God asks us to live our lives that way too. Keeping the faith, that's an old saying we hear a lot. Keep the faith. And you've probably heard that before. We should keep the faith. We're keeping the faith. Keeping the faith means so much more than just believing and waiting. Keeping the faith literally means to keep your ways of faith sharpened. To keep your life of faith sharpened and in ready use. And that means those spiritual gifts that you've each been given, and we've all been given spiritual gifts, to use them regularly, to practice those skills, to put them to work frequently. So that spiritual gift you've been given, put it to use. The Bible that you have at home, open it up and read it, put it to use. The prayer life that you have, put it to use, put it into action. The call to serve our neighbors, to serve one another, put it to use. Do that, because the more we do it, the more our faith grows. Like a musician practicing an instrument, the more we do it, the better we become and the more prepared we will be when the teacher returns. Anytime you have an opportunity to practice what Jesus has taught you to do it. Don't ever overlook an opportunity to serve or an opportunity to actually live the life that Jesus calls us to live. Because like anything else in life, like I said, the more you do it, the better you'll become at it, the more natural it'll feel, the more you grow. So take all the stuff that you've learned about Jesus, and don't just bank it into your memory and wait until he returns, but take all that stuff that you've learned about Jesus and Put it into practice. Put it into motion. Take that extra lamp oil. That's the language we get from this parable. Like when a musician practices or an athlete practices. The more you do it, the more you grow. And that's what it means to be spiritually ready. That's what Jesus is telling the disciples to do in this parable, in this gospel lesson today. And the good news for us, and this is really good news, is that the door is not yet shut. The door is still open, and there is still time to put into practice what we've learned. There's time to put our faith to work in our lives and in the lives of others. It's not too late yet. We may not know the day or the hour, but we do know what we're supposed to do in the meantime. Amen? Amen.